it's necessary to look at the broader picture. So far we have just discussed dates and people and musical texts and musical works, and these are all little points, little factoids from which a picture of the history of Indian music begins to emerge. But unfortunately, interpreting these various factoids in many ways is like interpreting an ink blot. You know, the ink blot test that psychologists use? In many ways it's the same way. We have to take these factoids and make some type of sense out of it. And to do this, and to do this effectively, let's turn our attention from these various points and historical entities and books, and again look at the big picture. If we draw a very simple picture from the facts we had outlined in the earlier section of this tape, we get a process which looks like this. Notice that it is a very, very linear interpretation of history. It's a very, very linear path that extends from the Samaveda down to the various texts and then right to contemporary musical practice. And I don't doubt that many people will hold this as the model of history in their mind, but it is simplistic to the point of just being absolutely wrong. Even a very brief look at it shows that there are many side branches which are just simply not acknowledged. So this linear approach, this linear view of the history of the development of North Indian music, we can just simply discount without any further discussion. This brings us to another way of looking at it, which is extremely common, and this would be a process of differentiation. Here we find what the process of looking at the development of North Indian music from a standpoint of differentiation looks like. Notice that in this model we see the development of music coming from the Samaveda and then down through the various texts, and then to differentiate into North Indian music, South Indian music, and various other musical forms which we find today. This view of the development of Indian music is probably the most common of all. Now, we cannot say this is wrong, but again, this is simplistic to the point of being misleading. Again, I need to draw your attention to the fact that if you look at the early periods, that is the period that goes from the Samaveda to the Natya Shastra, to the Brihadeshi, and then on to the 12th century text, we find that there is really no connection which can be that can clearly be established. We can only infer things going on between. There's just too much of a gap in terms of time, too many missing genres and missing approaches to music. And also we find that although the process of differentiation is certainly a very valid point and is certainly important as a way to look at history, again, it misses the point in some ways because there is also a process of amalgamation. Now let us look at the development of North Indian music from the standpoint of amalgamation. If we look at this model, we see that North Indian music, Hindustani classical music as we see it today, is an amalgamation of a number of influences. So we have indigenous Indian influences, which perhaps can be traced to the Samaveda. We have a number of foreign influences. We have influences from Persia, whose influence is extremely strong. If we look at the amalgamation model even further, we can also find elements coming from folk music, from the music of China and the Orient, and even elements coming from the West. So now here we have two different viewpoints, two different ways of looking at the broad picture of the history of Indian music. We have one of amalgamation and we have one of differentiation. Now, it should be clear that both are very, very valid principles, very, very valid processes that we find in the development of North Indian music. So what does it look like when we combine amalgamation and differentiation? If we combine these two very valid approaches, this is what it looks like. Well, I think that you can see the complexity of looking at it from this standpoint makes things a little bit difficult. It's a little difficult to wrap our mind around it. Although this may be technically a correct way of looking at the development of North Indian music, it's a little complicated to store in our mind until we realize something simple. This whole complex mishmash of varying influences can be held to be analogous to a pool of culture, a pool of music, for which there are a number of influences going in, and a number of different specific genres and musical styles and musical traditions are derived. If we look at it as a standpoint of being a pool of culture, a pool of music, then this is probably a much better way of looking at the history of the development of Indian music.